Hello listeners, and welcome to Plugged In, the Energy News podcast from Montel, where we bring you the latest news, issues and changes happening in the energy sector. A NATO member attacking another? The breakup of the transatlantic order? Only 18 months ago, such statements would have been the realm of wild hyperbole, of fantasy. Donald Trump seems to be full steam ahead with his ambition to take over Greenland. This week, we've seen a wave of global leaders stand up to the concept of might is right. Let me quote from the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, who said this week in Davos that we're in the midst of a rupture. The multicultural institutions on which the middle powers have relied, the WTO, the UN, the COP, the very architecture of collective problem-solving are under threat. As a result, many countries are drawing the same conclusions that they must develop greater strategic autonomy in energy, food, critical minerals, in finance and supply chains. And this impulse is understandable. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, called the current crisis seismic and permanent. Will the EU retaliate and use its bazooka to the threats and escalating trade war coming from the White House? But with the EU relying on favourable tariffs from the US and a solid supply of LNG this year, it begs the question, how strong is Europe's hand in this political power game? In this episode, we'll be speaking about the dynamics at play here and the consequences for Europe's energy sector. But first, I'm joined by our Deputy Editor-in-Chief, Lawrence Walker. Welcome back to the podcast, Laurie.
Thank you, Richard.
Now, we recorded this episode with our guests before Trump's speech, but we're recording now after. It was quite a long, rambling speech, and Trump managed to basically have a rant against renewable energy, insult several global leaders. But what were the key takeaways in your view, Laurie?
Yes, I mean, certainly long and rambling are two good descriptions of his speech. I mean, he was very clear from the way he's talking. He's not backing down on his views on renewable energy and the prominence of gas and LNG in the mix, and how perhaps Europe has been maybe making the wrong choices in recent years in its energy transition. It was very much like a headmaster telling off the kids, and I don't think it will be taken terribly seriously, what he said. At the same time, it does obviously raise concerns about his attitude towards his partners in Europe, his allies in Europe, you could say, and the way he feels he can just keep pushing us around, I guess.
I mean, it's at least he sort of confirmed that he wouldn't take Greenland by force.
Yes, so there is, like everything, there are a few silver linings, but yes, I think it was a rather combative speech, a rather aggressive speech, and one perhaps scattered with perhaps inaccuracies, but also a lack of perhaps context to what is really going on in Europe's energy market.
And it also seemed to confuse Iceland and Greenland.
And windmills and wind turbines, yep.
And we're going to delve into the detail of the issues generally with our guests in a moment. But what are market participants most concerned about at the moment?
Well, in terms of the gas, the LNG, I think market participants are most afraid of some kind of curtailment to supply, some kind of issue which is going to affect flows from America. Obviously, since the war in Ukraine, Europe's increased its imports of LNG from America to help reduce our supply from elsewhere, or from Russia. And I mean, last year alone, we saw something like nearly a 60% increase in LNG from America. It's become, cornerstone of our supply now. So if there's anything which is likely to disrupt that in any way, people are going to be concerned.
What will you and other reporters at Montel News be keeping a very close eye on in the coming days and weeks?
Any further indications on what could be included in any kind of tariffs, any kind of tit-for-tat policy against each other, anything that will affect flows, perhaps alternative options as well. So perhaps we will see other suppliers stepping in, stepping up supply. Maybe we'll see people turning to other countries. So we've got the likes of Qatar. We have other suppliers. It's not just America there, but obviously, I think we will be looking to see quite how, as a supply and demand is likely to be affected by what's happening, and just trying to really keep on top of Trump's perhaps erratic decision making.
So I think it's going to, with one thing's for certain anyway, Laurie, it's going to be a very, very busy few days for you and weeks as well, and for Montel's news reporters. So thanks very much, Laurie, for your input here. Now, I'm pleased to be joined by Anne-Sophie Corbeau from the Centre on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University and the Chief Economist at Rystad Energy, Claudio Galimberti. Now, a warm welcome to the podcast, both.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Claudio, I'd like to start with you. As we speak, there are discussions, and Trump is due to speak in Davos. But there seems to be an escalation on the Greenland issue. It caused massive rifts. So he's been threatening some European NATO allies with high tariffs if they oppose his plans. What's your take here, and how can we see this situation unfolding in the coming days, especially with regard to a potential trade war?
Thank you very much, Richard. What I would say is that we need to listen very carefully to what the Trump administration is saying, U.S. President Trump himself, and what the government in Europe are saying. The threat of a tariff is there. The threat of an outright trade war between the United States and Europe is there. Let's not forget what happened in 2025. There was the famous Liberation Day on April 2nd. President Trump announced the huge tariffs, and something really remarkable happened, which is specifically the European Union did not retaliate. One of the reasons why this rise of protectionism was not, in my view, accompanied by a drop in activity, which typically happens, it happened in the past, right, in the 1930s and so on and so forth, was probably the most important element was the lack of retaliation, right? So only China, only Canada, and a few handful countries decided to retaliate, and the United States backed down, right, specifically when it came to China. Now, it doesn't look like in this situation Europe is ready to back down. So I see this as a very high risk that there could be a trade war between the United States and Europe. So simply put, but I caution also against assuming this as the most likely scenario. So I think that this is probably a very high stake kind of negotiation by the Trump administration on one side and of course Europe on the other side. I'm very eager to hear what Anne-Sophie has to say in terms of geopolitical implication. If you ask me in terms of macro implication, the macro picture on the ground is still very benign, right? So we enter 2026 on the back of very strong growth. You may say mainly driven by investment in AI, but if you look at the reality is that even the consumer in the United States is relatively strong. So if I look at the GDP, the nowcast GDP from the Atlanta Federal Reserve right now, the United States apparently is growing at 5%. So it's we are in a benign situation, and that's probably one of the reasons why the negotiation is so high stake. But again, it's very risky. If you start going into the spiral of of a tit for tat, then things can go wrong very quickly.
Absolutely, Claudio. So I think what I was going to also ask you about is, I mean, it's clear here that trade policy is being weaponized, is it not?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. So, how does this affect the existing US-EU deal that was signed in the summer, for example? Can that be rowed back on? That can be, basically annulled? Is that a possibility or a very distant one?
By all means, it can, right? So we need to see. I mean, what the next few hours and the next few days are crucial to understand the kind of the direction of whole negotiation and the events here. So the deal that was signed last year was extremely important, right? So the United States only quote unquote, a relatively low tariff in comparison to the one that they had threatened in April, and everything was settled, right? So pretty much, if you look at the import-export from Europe into the United States, it didn't get affected by these 15% tariffs. So in most cases, what the Europeans are selling into America are high-value goods, pretty much, and therefore the price elasticity is relatively low, right? So if you're selling Mercedes, if you're selling champagne, 15% more is not that big of a deal. The problem is, what if now we go from there to 25 and probably 50%? That, of course, becomes a completely different ballgame.
Absolutely. I'd like to bring you in here, Anne-Sophie. I think, how do you think the potential for a trade war will impact Europe and its energy sector?
Well, of course, now Europe has become much more dependent on the US, especially on the LNG side, because when Russia curtailed its gas pipeline supplies to Europe in 2022, it was LNG which came to the rescue. And in particular, it has been US LNG. And the fact is that we have now become quite dependent on US LNG exports. Last year in 2025, we imported a total of 145 billion cubic meters of LNG, of which we had 80 BCM of US LNG. So it's not possible right now to just replace that. There is no real alternative supply of LNG. Of course, we have a lot of LNG which is coming to the market as we speak between now and 2030 or the early 2030s. But a lot of this LNG is actually US LNG. So for Europe to really reduce its dependency on US LNG, that will require something much more drastic, and of course it will require more time than what we have now. It's this dependency which is creating a lot of issues on top of the Thunberg deal that we have mentioned before. When I heard about that deal, I do remember it was on Sunday, and the following day I was flying to New York, and I was scrambling to understand the numbers. The numbers, in my opinion, do not make any sense. We agreed to import 250 billion of US energy. Right now, we are importing something like, at least this is what the European Commission said, between 90 and 100 billion dollars per year. Okay, so let's say, we increase, for example, US LNG, and that was 2024, by the way. We increase US LNG, which is what we have been doing, but US LNG is only a fraction of the total. US LNG in 2024 was 15 billion. So even if we double that, this is a very small part. Now, are we going to import a lot of nuclear power plants from the US? Okay, maybe that can help. But my point is that this number is aspirational. However, it also creates a possibility for the United States to say, actually, you have not reached $250 billion. So in exchange, we can ask for more on, let's forget about the regulation on methane. Let's forget about the CS3D, the Sustainability Directive, or let's forget about a lot of things which may actually not be related to energy sector. So this is a very good bargaining tool for the United States to actually ask for more coming from Europe.
And not just in terms of energy, because, I suppose the methane, of course, the methane rules are obviously energy related, but the
Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Yes, I know.
Seriously, it's another kind of part of this abbreviation, the jargon, absolutely. But that's not so much a part. Well, of course, it's a part of the equation that the US doesn't like.
It's part, but when you're thinking about Qatar, Qatar has specifically said, I am no longer going to export to Europe unless this is watered down. And Qatar would be the alternative LNG supplier if we were in trouble with US. But Qatar has explicitly said, actually, no. So this is putting us in a kind of difficult situation, right? And this is exactly a paper that we published just before Christmas, which was the EU in a petrostate and electrostate world. And actually, we didn't know that the situation would worsen that much over the Christmas break. But the fact is that Europe is stuck between two energy giants. You have the US and you have China. And in order to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels, we need to electrify. But by doing so, we are going to become more dependent on the electrostate and its electrification technologies, which is China.
Yeah, we're caught between three rocks as well, if you include Qatar in there as well. So, Anne-Sophie, would you say then that that the US is very powerfully, leveraging the dependency that Europe has on its LNG to get what it wants over Greenland, or that it could easily do that?
They have not actually mentioned that yet, but there is always a threat, from behind that, maybe we could curtail the US LNG export. Although exactly how the president and the executive branch would do that remains to be seen. But we have seen over the past year that they don't attach a lot of importance to the rules. So this is potentially something that they could do. Although it's important to remember that we have a lot of different LNG exporters in the US, which are private companies. So this is not Gazprom, for example. This is not a repetition of what has happened with Russia, with Gazprom, and Russia curtailing pipeline gas supplies to Europe. But you could imagine potentially a scenario where that would happen, potentially. Or that, the US would say, well, we are sending the LNG somewhere else. However, I would caution that for the United States, this may be a very dangerous strategy because first, the US is no longer exporting LNG to China, which is the largest LNG importer. Second, Europe is a very important LNG market right now, so you don't want to antagonize them too much. And third, that will be a huge precedent of, again, weaponizing LNG supplies, and then who would trust the United States? The beauty of US LNG has been that it has come to the rescue when needed, and also that it's flexible. And I think the Trump administration doesn't seem to understand that. And so far, they have not completely crossed the border between letting market work and really using and directing the LNG supplies. They have not been there, but they have been very keen on incentivizing companies in Europe, in Japan, in Korea, in Malaysia, in Thailand, everywhere, to sign more long-term contracts. So the deal was that, okay, we have this trade deal and US energy is a part of the negotiation. It's a part of the commercial negotiation. You need to buy more US energy.
I think in the same position that the US exporters of LNG are private companies, you could also say Europe is not just one entity; it's also a selection of private companies, of course. So I think that's often gets a little bit misunderstood. So I think that's an important clarification there, Anne-Sophie. But over to you, Claudio. What do you make of this weaponizing of LNG exports? What's your view? Do you think there's something that could happen, especially with regard to potentially to the Greenland issue, maybe even the way of getting the Nobel Peace Prize? But but what's your view here, Claudio?
I agree 100% with analysis done by Anne-Sophie. I think that Europe came to depend on the United States after the invasion of Ukraine, right? So right now the United States imports 50% of LNG into Europe. So replacing that is going to be a big problem. The United States managed to basically not just provide LNG but also oil to Europe, right? So there are significant export of oil. So indeed, Europe is again, like it happened many times in history, is again kind of at the mercy of the big energy exporter, right? So it used to be the Middle East and Russia. Right now, it's of course the United States. The United States has replaced Russia for the most part. And they, of course, so until now, the United States and Europe have been part of NATO. They are clearly allies. We need to ask ourselves if there is a deep crisis related to Greenland, what's going to happen to the alliance? What's going to happen to things like NATO, right? So these are the big geopolitical question. But I think that the negotiation between the United States and Europe is tilted in the United States' favor on many aspects. Energy is one. The military coverage of Europe is the other one. Europe clearly depends on on the United States when it comes to that. And so I think that Europe is in a difficult situation negotiation-wise, but they still have elements they can play, right? So it's not a foregone conclusion that Europe needs to give in to the US demands, in my view, right?
But it isn't a very weak position. I mean, that's very clearly,
It is weak, but Europe can, of course, try to, in this case, diversify. And I know it's not something you do, on a kind of you turn on a dime. But look at what Canada did just last week, right? So they sat down with China, and they started to sign some deals. So I think that if the situation becomes very confrontational, then it's going to be natural for Europe to look at alternatives.
And before I put that question or what the alternatives could be to Anne-Sophie, what's your view on a rift in the transatlantic alliance, that could be the breakup, that we could be seeing the breakup of NATO over specifically the Greenland issue?
Look, I look at history. We come from 80 years of an extreme, probably the most stable, one of the most stable alliance in the history, in the recent history, has been NATO, right? So 80 years of peace in Europe. I mean, the first episode of war was the war in Ukraine, and Ukraine, by the way, is not part of NATO. So I think that the likelihood, if I look at history, is very low, right? But it is the fact that, like Prime Minister Carney said just yesterday at Davos, we are witnessing the dismantling of the world order as we have seen, right? So if this will go to the extent of also potentially jeopardizing NATO, that is a possibility. We cannot rule that out. If you ask me what is, in my opinion, the likelihood, I think is still very low.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, but I think we also have to accept that maybe Donald Trump is living in a different reality, and I think a lot of real key. I mean, Mark Carney's speech was very, very clear and to the point, and also very, very, very concerning in many ways, Claudio. But Anne-Sophie, if I can turn to you, and if we look at this position of Europe, it's as you mentioned earlier, it's quite weak when it comes to negotiating, and also it's got this over 60% or around 60% of LNG imports came from the US last year. Can it replace these US supplies even if it wanted to? Are there alternative suppliers? I mean, Europe did quite well reducing its dependence on Russia very quickly, that was quite very successful, if I can say so, but can it do the same with American supplies?
Okay, so before I turn to energy, let me say just two things. I mean, the first word is that if Europe has been basically trying to negotiate with Trump in 2025, it was also out of concern for Ukraine, because you wanted to continue to be able to help Ukraine not get a peace deal, which would be in favor of Ukraine. And in particular, they are really concerned that, if you get a bad peace agreement on Ukraine, then in a few years from now, Russia may attack again, and this time they may attack Europe. So this is also what has been going on. If also the US were to take over Greenland, then China can take over Taiwan. I mean, why not? So that's also what we need to think about. But in terms of energy, and in particular in terms of natural gas, so first of all, we in Europe have not managed to reduce our dependency on Russian gas. It was Russia which cut the gas. Let's really remember that we haven't done anything at all. I posted something recently on LinkedIn showing that most of the job has been actually done by Russia. Of course, there were some companies saying, well, we're not going to agree to the terms of paying in ruble, etc. So, and knowing perfectly that what would happen was no more supplies. But most of the things has been Russia cutting the gas, Ukraine not agreeing to extend the deal, and some companies basically saying, okay, we're not going to agree to the terms. And then the rest, what we have been importing, this is going to be dealt with by the European sanctions. And that's it. But this is actually a small part. So now, how can we reduce our dependency on US energy? Well, the first thing is the demand side. I mean, I teach energy security. So the first thing is the demand side. You reduce your demand. There are two pillars, energy efficiency. And I know this is boring and politicians hate that, but this is very important, especially given that most of our gas demand, the majority is actually residential commercial. So this is what you need to reduce, which is basically things like insulation, heat pumps, etc. I have a heat pump just above my head, works perfectly. Second thing is electrification. You need to electrify. I mean, this is the only way to reduce your fossil fuel consumption. So that needs to be done, but knowing that indeed it makes you more dependent on Chinese technologies. And then in terms of trying to find alternative supplies, well, there are other suppliers of LNG in the world. I mentioned Qatar. There is going to be additional LNG supplies from various countries, a little bit coming from Canada, coming from different countries, but the bulk is really going to come from Qatar. And as I said, I mean, we have a relatively difficult relationship, especially as we are going to stop importing Russian LNG starting next year. So this is not a great situation. So I would say do more on the demand side, and then try to see what you can do on the supply side. There is one element that European politicians need to be focusing upon. This is the future of Norwegian gas. Because, we see this graphic from the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate, which are showing dwindling gas production. We need to understand what can be done there and whether maybe, a good agreement can be done between European countries and Norway, because Norway has been a reliable gas supplier. They have low methane emission. I don't think they are going to say, well, we are just going to stop supplying you because we don't like you anymore, because in any case, they depend on Europe in terms of gas exports. So I would do something like that. I would also look more at our own assets in terms of gas production. I know that we have very little left, and also at biomethane. So use everything. Oh, and by the way, to our Spanish friends, do not decommission the nuclear power plants. But for that, you need to convince Mrs. Riverano, because, I mean, even the German chancellor has finally admitted that decommissioning the nuclear power plants was a crucial mistake. And I'm not saying that because I'm French and I have actually worked as a teenager, as an intern in one of the nuclear power plants, which was last decommissioned. But it makes no sense. You keep whatever you can and it's still operating. I mean, that was such a mistake, and the Spanish are about to do the same. So what can still work safely has to stay, period.
Absolutely. I mean, the world did look quite different in 2011, 2012 to what it looks now, though, Anne-Sophie. And,
I am sorry. I am talking about the stupid decision which was made in 2022 by the Green Minister, Mr. Habeck, because, rule number one, Green German minister is, I hate nuclear. Well, that was stupid, sir, with due apologies. It was a stupid decision.
Yeah, you've made that very clear, Anne-Sophie. Absolutely, yes. And I think the electrification is a crucial element here, and accelerating the green transition. But that doesn't happen quickly anyway. But I think, and we're on the cusp of potential supply disruptions potentially. Anyway, but Claudio, I'd like to turn to you again and talk a little bit about some other issues that could impact the global supply of gas, but also oil, such as what's happening in Iran. What's your perspective here on how that could impact the global oil and gas trade?
Absolutely. So Iran is the other flashpoint. We are living through a period of extreme geopolitical risks. So we have Iran, Ukraine, and Russia, and of course Venezuela. So Iran is probably, from an oil perspective, is the riskiest one, in the sense that the country produces between 3.2 and 3.5 billion barrels a day of oil, and exports about 1.5. That is a very significant production. So we're talking about roughly 3.5% of global oil demand. Of course, Iran has been teetering on the verge of unrest, social unrest, political unrest for many years. There was a major unrest back in 2022. It was repressed. There was one last week. Obviously, it was also repressed, at least so far. The protests have taken place around the capital city, Tehran. The oil fields are kind of far, right? So they tend to be closer to the Gulf. The point is that you cannot be certain. Once you have a major political event, we saw that in Libya, we saw that in Iraq in the past 20 years. Typically, oil production ends up being affected, right? So Libya went from 1.5 million barrels a day to zero overnight when Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown, and Iraq was. It took many years to reestablish a production at the level before the removal of Saddam Hussein. So the situation in Iran is stable from the standpoint of oil production. So that has not been affected so far. Let's not forget that almost all the exports for the past 3-4 years have gone to China, because technically they are sanctioned, so they're not supposed to be exported. But of course, through the dark fleet, they end up in China at a huge discount. So the risk is that if there is let's say, if unrest comes back to Iran, and if there is a military intervention by the United States, which last week appeared imminent, right? So it appeared really imminent. Then you can potentially expect days, weeks, and also months of much lower production, right? So that is one risk. Is it a big one? Currently, not really. And the reason is that if I look at the latest numbers, oil supply sits at around 108 million barrels per day, and oil demand at roughly 105. So we are building inventory at the speed of 3 million barrels per day. So even if we were to lose theoretically the entire production of Iran overnight, we would not be immediately in a situation of undersupply. We would actually be quite balanced right now. The problem is, of course, this is a temporary situation. If I look at probably towards the middle of the year or towards the end of this year, we will not most likely be in an oversupply situation. So this is we cannot take this situation for granted for the next few months. Therefore, that is one thing. The other is Iran sits very close. Well, it's basically the Strait of Hormuz is there, so it's between Iran and the United Emirates, and the risk when you have a very unstable situation in Iran is that there could be disruption to the strait. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important choke points in the world, along with that of Malacca. Right. So in both cases, you are talking about between 18 and 20 million barrels a day of oil, primarily crude, but also in some cases oil products going through the straits. If anything happened, and by the way, in the past 80 years, the Straits of Hormuz have been quiet, right? So even during the Iran-Iraq war, there was no problem in the Straits of Hormuz, and that could have been the case, right, if you think about it. But if there was a problem there, then it would be a major problem for the entire world, for the global economy. So you could expect oil prices going up even 150, probably even $200 per barrel, because then you are potentially removing 20% of oil supply in one go. The reason why I think this is extremely unlikely, it's not only historically it's never happened. The second thing is that the Strait of Hormuz is actually quite big. So it's very difficult for a navy like or for an army like the Iranian one to blockade it. And the third is that they would have the entire war against it, right? Because everybody would hurt from the blockage of Strait of Hormuz. It's not just the West, but it's also China. It's everybody is going to be hurt, because you would have a major spike in oil prices. So I think it's very unlikely, but of course you cannot rule these things out. You know, when you have things like unrest, wars, and stuff like this, things can quickly go out of control.
And if we've learned anything in the last sort of 3 to 4 years, the world is very unpredictable and uncertain. Just a final question for both of you. It's time to get the crystal ball out. What do you think was going to be the outcome of what's happening in Davos? Do you think, in terms of Greenland, in terms of a trade war, do you think we can see an escalation, or are things going to start to de-escalate and there's going to be a bit of a compromise, or lots of people seeking compromise and deals here? Anne-Sophie, can I start with you?
It's very difficult to know. I mean, I think, we would need to understand what exactly Trump's message is going to be, and what the response of the Europeans is going to be. Let's imagine Trump has a very strong message. We are going to take over Greenland, whatever you say. What are the Europeans going to say? I mean, and my point is that, over the past year, again, they have not tried to challenge Trump too much. And right now we are in a situation where, in particular, France is very weak. I mean, Trump, for all the things that he's saying, he was right on one thing. I mean, Macron is about to leave, and we might actually no longer have a government by the end of this week. So this is not helpful. And we need also a united Europe, which is kind of difficult. So I'm trying to look positive, but it's kind of difficult for the Europeans.
Yep, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think it's certainly, as we discussed, a position of weakness at the moment, exacerbated by internal issues in key European member states. Claudio, over to you. What do you think?
It's extremely difficult indeed, right? So it's difficult to predict these things, but so let's put it this way. I think that the interest of the United States in Greenland is mainly military, right? So it's the Gold Dome that the United States is trying to build, and the proximity of Greenland makes it extremely important for the United States to have some sort of control over the island. Do I expect this to end up in the United States making it the 51st state? I don't think so, right? Because that, in my view, would jeopardize an extremely important relationship the United States has with Europe. But I do believe that the United States will try to get as much control on this island as possible, because they need to build this Gold Dome. And how does this pan out? It's probably going to be a very tough negotiation between the European countries, NATO, and the United States. I think eventually they're going to sit down and get a deal done, and the deal would mean that probably we have much stronger military presence of the United States in Greenland. That's my prediction. I hope it goes like this, but we cannot rule out something like a more profound rift between the two main parties here.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll be joining me and watching events in Davos and beyond extremely, extremely closely. So, Claudio and Anne-Sophie, thank you very much for being guests on the Plugged In podcast. A fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cohen. Thank you. Yes.